So I want to talk to you today about mental health interventions for tinnitus, specifically about mental health interventions that go beyond just cognitive behavior therapy, which most of you are probably familiar with, although I will talk a little bit about CBT today. But limiting yourself to cognitive behavior therapy when working with tinnitus is a bit like going to a fine restaurant with a 5-course meal and only eating one of the courses, and I would argue not even the main course. So I am Peter Vernizzi. I am a licensed therapist in Arizona. In regards to the interventions I will be talking about today, I am a qualified teacher of mindfulness-based stress reduction. I am also on the national provider list for cognitive processing therapy, which is the form of CBT the VA uses for trauma. As well, I'm a meditation teacher trained in the Shambhala tradition now for 30 years. And in addition, I do have tinnitus, like all of you watching this. So why mental health interventions are important, I think, becomes clearer as we look at this quote from the National Center for Rehabilitative Auditory Research. Many people with bothersome tinnitus spend a lot of time and energy, and money we might add, searching for a way to quiet or eliminate the tinnitus. Unfortunately, there currently is no therapy that can safely or consistently reduce the loudness of tinnitus. So the tinnitus is going to go its own way. It has its own course, its own strategy that we are not able to influence. All we can influence is how we respond to the tinnitus. Fortunately, that's quite a bit. It has quite a bit of control, how we respond to tinnitus. And this is precisely what mental health interventions are designed to work with. That is our response to tinnitus. So we'll get started with certainly the most popular, most common mental health therapy that is used for tinnitus, and that is cognitive behavior therapy. I should also point out cognitive behavior therapy is the most popular, most tested, most reliable form of therapy in general. It's often called the gold standard of therapies because of its consistent results across a variety of problems. What exactly is cognitive behavior therapy? Well, we could do a whole session on that, and that's not what we're going to do here. This definition is from the website for the Beck Institute. Aaron Beck is the founder of cognitive behavior therapy. He just died last year sometime, not too long ago, at age 100. His daughter is still affiliated with the Beck Institute. And they define it on their webpage, and I think this is a nice, concise definition. CBT is based on the theory that the way individuals perceive a situation is more closely connected to their reaction than the situation itself. Individuals' perceptions are often distorted and unhelpful, particularly when they are distressed. Cognitive behavior therapy helps people identify their distressing thoughts and evaluate how realistic the thoughts are. Then they learn to challenge the distorted thinking. When they think more realistically, they feel better. The emphasis is also consistently on solving problems and initiating behavioral change. So let me put a little diagram to that idea here to make it, I think, the basic idea is fairly simple to understand, and it's actually been around for a couple thousand years before Beck and cognitive behavior therapy. It's an idea we find in the ancient Greek Stoics. The Stoic Epictetus famously said, it's not what happened to us that matters, but how we respond to what happens. And so for CBT, it's not that an event or situation causes me to have a particular emotion. Instead, it's my thought, my belief about the event that causes my reaction, not the event itself. And I am in control of my thoughts or beliefs about the action, even if I can't control the event itself. So how does this work in an example? Well, imagine a situation that you get cut off in traffic, happens to any of us who drive. And someone slams in front of you. You have to slow down, and you think, what a jerk. And as a result, you might get angry. This guy's insulting you. Your blood pressure, your heart rate increases. You may even start shouting at the guy. And you might, speed up to try to pass him even. Do all sorts of crazy things. That's one reaction. You might think, let's say you got in an accident because of that. When your wife asks you what happened, you would say, well, I got in an accident because this guy cut me off in traffic. But what CBT tells us is it's not the event that causes the reaction. It's our reaction to it. So you can imagine someone else getting cut off in traffic and, thinking instead, person probably just didn't see me. Or maybe thinking, God, that guy might be in a real hurry to have to, make a stupid move like that. And you recognize, you take a breath, and you just continue driving. Right? Both of those reactions are imaginable from the same situation. The idea being, again, that it's not the situation that causes our reaction. Instead, it is our thoughts or beliefs about the situation. And this general strategy is then applied to tinnitus. And we're not going to go into detail, as I said, but this is one example. So the situation might be you notice a spike, your tinnitus increases, and you start what we call in CBT catastrophizing. The tinnitus is not going to return to normal. I'm going to be stuck at this level. I can't stand it. I'm going crazy. And as a result, you get anxious, maybe sad. Again, the same heart rate increase, blood pressure increase, anxious, nervous. And that becomes the consequence. And when your wife maybe asks you what's going on, you say, well, I'm nervous because, or I'm anxious, or I'm angry because my tinnitus is increasing. Right? The event caused my reaction. And what CBT is going to say is, no, the event didn't cause your reaction because there was another way to respond to a spike. You could have just recognized, okay, this is a spike. It happens. I've had these before. It always ends. And I'm going to engage in some practices that I know can either relax me, maybe meditation, or distract myself. And I will, if I take that tact with those belief structures in place, the consequences are going to be very different from than if I had gone on to this rampage or rant about how I'm going to just spin out of control as a result of this increase. So again, same situation, different outcome, depends upon our thoughts or beliefs about a situation. This is what CBT does. It works with our beliefs about tinnitus in order to change the way we react or respond to tinnitus. And as many of you probably know, the success of CBT as a therapy, and it usually takes at least 6 to 8 weeks of work in a therapeutic context, but this is the latest of a systematic review that found positive results, as every review of CBT working with tinnitus has found. I think there's an interesting caveat here that guided self-administered forms of CBT had larger effect sizes. That is self-help CBT. Only face-to-face CBT was showing to make significant improvements. Translate that is, you need to do CBT with a therapist to really get the benefit. And this is, I think, if you think about it, it makes sense. We tend to like our beliefs, our own cognitive distortions, if you will, and it's pretty hard for us to talk ourselves out of our own beliefs. We need an objective and skilled observer to work with our beliefs. And they don't simply tell you your belief is false. A good CBT therapist it's more of an art than a science. A good CBT therapist is showing you that you yourself don't accept the belief that you are espousing at the time. It's very Socratic in nature. And it's a talent to be a good CBT therapist. That said, there is an excellent book. It just came out last year that propounds itself as a self-help book. And it's a wonderful book. It can be used on your own. There is a website with a lot of video resources as well. Cognitive Behavior Therapy for Tinnitus, a Manualized Therapy. And I can give you the information of that later on, but that if you're serious about CBT, that's a book to get. When I work with people on CBT, this is the book I work with them on. So let's move on, though, from CBT. Why? Well, because the evidence tells us we should. CBT is not the only intervention that's been shown to be helpful when it comes to tinnitus. Other therapies I'll talk about, acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness, EMDR, and in fact, as well, there are other interventions that have not specifically been tried on tinnitus, but they've been shown to work on the same conditions that tinnitus provokes. For example, anxiety. We know what works on anxiety, and we have every reason to believe that that same intervention, for example, DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, should work on tinnitus-related anxiety. So we're going to take a look beyond CBT, and we're going to start with mindfulness. Now, this is a term that's been in the societal conversation for quite some time now. Actually, and people have different ideas of it, and you may be acquainted with it, you may not. There are various definitions of it. The one I'm going to give you is a fairly standard one we're going to work with. And that is mindfulness is essentially a non-judgmental present moment awareness or attention. So it's bringing our attention or awareness into the present moment and doing so without any judgment. This is a state of mindfulness. It's simply being aware of what's going on in the present and not reacting to it, not trying to push it away and not being overwhelmed with it. So that's the basic idea of the state of mindfulness. Now, what does this have to do with tinnitus? In order to understand it, we have to understand that mindfulness and mindfulness training is primarily designed to work with the flight or fight response and to bring us out of fight or flight is the main task of mindfulness training. So what's fight or flight? Fight or flight is the automatic reaction to an event that is perceived as stressful. This perception of a threat, and it can be a bear in the woods, it can be a guy driving in traffic, it can be a thought in our head. The perception activates what's called the sympathetic nervous system, and I'll talk about that in a second. But essentially, think about a time when you have been stressed or afraid. You trigger what's called a stress response, that it prepares the body to either run away or fight. So this is essentially what tinnitus does. It does the same thing to the body that, say, seeing a bear in the woods or getting stuck in a traffic jam or having a fight with your spouse does. It takes the body into the state of fight or flight where things like our blood pressure increases, our heart rate increases, blood flow is moved away from actually the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of the brain, because you don't need your brain to run away or fight. It's kind of also why we say and do stupid things in fight or flight. Tinnitus, as I said, puts the body into fight or flight in two different ways, I would argue. That is both the sound of tinnitus, that annoying sound that stresses the body into thinking there's danger. I know in my own case, it's a very loud, continually chirping noise that is my body reacts to in the same way it reacts to any threat. And it's also the case that our thoughts about tinnitus can put the body into fight or flight. So tinnitus, puts the body into fight or flight. And meditation and mindfulness training, in particular, activates what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is what balances the sympathetic nervous system and gets us out of fight or flight. So mindfulness training is used to counter the effects of the tinnitus, both in thought and in the actual sound of the tinnitus. And to think about how this works, we can think about what goes on with tinnitus. As I said, what the sound does to us, we perceive this sound, however you have it, as a form of a threat. And as we perceive that as a threat, the body goes into fight or flight. And when we're in fight or flight, the mind follows suit, follows task, and starts thinking the worst, and it just exacerbates the sense of threat. And this simply continues as the stronger we try to push away from it and run away or fight it. For what we resist persists, and both fighting and running away are forms of resisting. So if we continue to perceive it as a threat, we're not going to habituate to it. Right? This is a form of just being exposed to something is not necessarily going to guarantee that we no longer see it as a threat. We can just continue to be threatened by exposure. So we have to be a little more wise, a little more thoughtful on how we are going to work at bringing about a sense of where we no longer perceive the tinnitus as a threat. And this is what mindfulness training can do. Through mindfulness training, we train the body, I'll talk about how we do that, to respond in a non-judgmental way to external triggers in general and to the trigger of tinnitus in particular. So it's this training the body not to react to the sound of tinnitus is what allows us then to be in a state of calm with that tinnitus is there. And at first, we're not we may bring it down from a 90 to a 60, or we may be in calm for 30 seconds rather than not at all. So it's a gradual wearing away of getting used to being in a calm state, having the body in a calm state with respect to the tinnitus. And that is essentially the process, through which habituation is going to take place. And we know, in fact, that this works. We have evidence now in terms of numerous studies. Up to now, there's been 7 pretty thorough studies using mindfulness training in tinnitus patients, and they've had great, pretty significant consequences, pretty good results. I'm happy to give you the some of the literature and links to other places on my channel where you can see where I discuss this. But basically the idea is that mindfulness training brings about a decrease of tinnitus distress scores post-therapy in 7 moderate to high quality studies, with 6 of the 7 showing significant decrease in tinnitus distress directly after training. So we know it works. And we then should integrate it into our tinnitus toolkit. Now, I think it's important, and this is the most important part of this, is it's not just telling yourself to be mindful. Mindfulness is a training. We don't tell ourselves to be mindful, we train ourselves to be mindful. And there is a recognized training for mindfulness. And all of the studies that they did on tinnitus use some version of this training called mindfulness-based stress reduction. It's a practice I train and I teach because it works with tinnitus. It's an 8-week program, meets 2.5 hours a week. There's usually an extended retreat session between the 6th and the 7th week. In each class, you have a variety of mindfulness practices, sitting meditation, walking meditation, moving meditations. There's discussion and practice, and you're also expected to do 45 minutes of practice a week, plus a variety of informal exercises. So when we say mindfulness decreases tinnitus distress, we're not just saying being mindful decreases tinnitus distress, we're saying developing the quality through this practice. And in particular, this 8-week program is what we know works. That's the only thing that's been studied. So when we talk about mindfulness, we're talking about undergoing a program of mindfulness study to bring about the consequences. One more thing about mindfulness training, and this is, I think, a great thing about it, is mindfulness, this training, MBSR, was originally developed more than 40 years ago to work with stress, to reduce stress, hence the name of it, mindfulness-based stress reduction. It's still the best stress reduction tool we know. It's much more effective than medication. I can give you the research on that. It's also non-addictive, except in a good way, I guess. Like running's addictive. And we know it works to keep our stress level low. That's why it's developed. That's why it's most effective. And why this is important is because, as we all know, stress is a key factor in the worsening of our tinnitus. If we can keep stress under control, we're going to go a long way to keeping our tinnitus under control. And the way to keep stress under control is mindfulness training, mindfulness practice. We also know if you quit practicing after the 8-week course, like if you quit running, the benefits disappear. So practice mindfulness. Moving on then. One last thing here. So how do these two compare? In many ways, they're complementary. CBT works with thoughts. Mindfulness really working with the body in a way. It's a little more complicated than that, but for our purposes here, we can stick to that. CBT is a top-down strategy that works at changing our way we think to influence our emotion. Well, mindfulness works on training the body not to respond to the react to situations in a stressful manner. Now, the benefit or superiority of mindfulness, if you will, is that more of the connections go from the body to the brain than go from the brain to the body. So we're better off, working with the body connection and calming the body, and then working with thoughts as well in a secondary fashion. But both, as I said, are useful, and I think work for the most part in conjunction. Okay, so actually one more therapy I want to talk about that's been specifically tested on tinnitus, and then the other ones have not been tested specifically on tinnitus, but they do. There's every reason to believe they will work on tinnitus. And this is mindfulness. This is called acceptance and commitment therapy, known as ACT or ACT most commonly. And there's been only a couple of studies, but they've had very impressive results. I don't know why they haven't done more. A study comparing ACT and CBT showed both treatments having large decrease in tinnitus distress. And one comparing ACT to tinnitus retraining therapy showed ACT was superior. So what is ACT or acceptance and commitment therapy? Again, a big question. I'm going to basically talk about it in a simplistic way, but it's a way that should convey what it means. I think a way to think about it there are two components to ACT. The first component is acceptance, or essentially mindfulness, mindfully accepting what's going on. And the commitment is value therapy. So ACT uses these two components, value therapy and mindfulness. And a way to understand it is ACT uses metaphors, a lot of metaphors in ACT training. And you can find these videos actually online. One of them called the Unwanted Party Guest. And it goes like this. Imagine throwing a party for all your friends. You've been preparing this for quite some time. You got a lavish layout and everything's starting to go big. People are coming over. It's looking like it's going to be a good night. And then an unwanted guest arrived, Dave, your ultimately disgusting next door neighbor who you loathe. And he comes in and he starts making noise and threatening to ruin the whole thing. And you just walk him to the door and throw him out. And you go back to the party. But he comes back. You do the same thing. You walk him and you throw him out. He comes back. And this goes on. And ultimately you realize the only way you're going to keep Dave out of the party is if you guard the door. And don't let him in. And it's like sit out front because you can go around back, because you're going to have to stay there and guard for Dave to show up. But if you do that, no party. What ACT tells us is just go back to the party. Let Dave come in. Dave comes in. What you notice is that you can still have a good time if Dave is there. Right? And you also notice that if you stop bugging him or worrying about him, Dave kind of calms down a bit. Your reaction almost drives Dave to be Dave. Now, ACT uses this for psychological distress in general. The ACT theory is that you don't try to get rid of mental psychological distress. You learn to accept it. You don't push it away. You just learn that it's part of life. All life has a level of psychological distress. It sort of accepts the basic starting point of Buddhism. Life is suffering. It's difficult, rather. We'll say that. So you're going to have distress, and you just have to accept it. Mindfulness being a good way to work with acceptance. And if you can't accept it, you notice part of the problem is you're reacting against it was causing the problem in the first place. So why not just calm down? Things will actually go easier. That's the acceptance part of acceptance and commitment therapy. The commitment part really has to do with our values. And there's another video you could watch called 3 Happiness Myths online that talks about the ACT theory of happiness. And it basically is that we have a misconception of happiness according to ACT. We think it's this pleasant feeling that we should have all our life, and that's really what we want, and that's what happiness is. And what ACT tells us instead is that no, emotional turmoil, psychological distress is a part of life. True happiness is not found in a subjective feeling. Rather, it's found in living a life according to our values, living a life in things like intimate relationships, friendship, family, community, spirituality, our career. Happiness is the attainment and the struggle with these values, the living of these values. And when we come to dealing with all the unpleasantness, we know that these values can be attained and a meaningful life achieved regardless of our subjective distress, and this includes our distress and tinnitus. Right? Tinnitus can hinder us from achieving precisely none of our values, and if we place our focus on our values, that can give us a guiding light to work through the inherent unpleasantness of tinnitus. So that's, as I said, acceptance and commitment therapy in a nutshell, which consists in a number of practices to help us both be mindful and to work with our commitments. So now we get into therapies that haven't been tested on tinnitus per se, but we know they work for conditions that accompany tinnitus. And so we have every reason to believe that they should work with tinnitus. And indeed, in my work with tinnitus clients, I find great success in all of these interventions I'm going to talk about. The first one I'm going to talk about is called polyvagal informed therapy. Polyvagal is called because of the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in the body, and it's actually responsible for our friend the parasympathetic nervous system. If you remember, tinnitus throws the body into fight or flight. This is the sympathetic nervous system. The vagus nerve is responsible for the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms the sympathetic nervous system down. And it's the assumption, the working hypothesis of polyvagal theory, that our nervous system is in one of 3 places. It's either in a place of connection, which it calls the ventral vagal state. It's either mobilized in fight or flight, or we get disconnected into a shutdown state connected with the dorsal part of the vagus nerve. So 3 parts of the nervous system. When we're not tooling along on neutral, we're in one of these 3 places. And this is important because where we are determines how we see the world. And this is the polyvagal principle of story follows state. The state of our nervous system influences how we view ourselves, our world, and our tinnitus. Right? If I'm in this disconnected or fight or flight state with anything, I'm going to see the world through a darker lens than if I'm connected to family, friends, in the bosom of home, feeling comfortable. The world is more bearable and more delightful in that connected state. And the hypothesis then of polyvagal theory is we don't just happen to find ourselves in these states. We can mold our nervous system to be more friendly to the connected states. We can train ourselves to get out of fight or flight or these disconnected states through practices. So polyvagal theory or polyvagal work is really the work of training the nervous system, retraining the nervous system, if you will. And that's going to include retraining how we respond to our tinnitus and many practices that polyvagal theory uses. One practice, one whole therapy that is actually an ally with polyvagal theory in this this strategy is something called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, which was originally developed to work with something called borderline personality disorder, but it really works with helping us develop a general healthy emotional strategy. And there's a number of skills it uses, a number of practices and interventions that allow us to work with our nervous system to help us regulate our emotions better. One whole section of the 4 sections of DBT is called distress tolerance. And this is probably the most useful set of skills for working with tinnitus. Some of those skills of distress tolerance, one of them is called TIP, T-I-P. DBT uses a lot of acronyms. If you get into it, you'll find out. So T is we can change our nervous system essentially by putting your body in cold water. Just getting a cold washcloth on your face can help draw you out of fight or flight. Intense exercise is good for a nervous system that's in fight or flight because it gives us the sense that we've gotten away from the threat. On the flip side, there are various relaxation and breathing exercises that are excellent for calming the body down and getting it out of fight or flight. So DBT is just a whole array of exercises to work with the nervous system, to work with regulating ourselves emotionally. Another one, a DBT practice that I've had a lot of success working with tinnitus folks with is called radical acceptance. What we all need to do, radical acceptance. Radical means total and all the way. Accepting means just accepting it with your heart, mind, and body. That this is a situation, and we always have to radically accept situations we don't like but can't change. We embrace them because to fight them is to make life more difficult than it needs to be. We distinguish here between pain and suffering. Right? A painful situation like tinnitus brings us pain. Suffering is all the mental baggage we add to it by wishing it would be different. We don't have control over our pain, but we can control our suffering through something like radical acceptance is one way of working with ultimately accepting what's going on rather than trying to fight against it. And the last intervention I want to talk about is something called positive psychology, and on a positive note here. And it's simply put, the scientific study of what makes people thrive mentally, actually. It helps us develop ultimate ways to achieve or regain a sense of well-being. And there was an article, it's a 3-part article. The first part was in the Tinnitus Today in spring. The winter issue had the second part. These are just evidence-based practices that increase our well-being, and you could actually connect this up to polyvagal theory. It brings us into ventral vagal, into this peaceful, calm place. These practices that positive psychology teaches us. One of the most famous ones, one of the most tested ones, I should say, is the gratitude journal. Numerous studies have shown the benefits of keeping track of why we are grateful on a regular basis. Here's just one study that had 200 patients were randomly divided between writing things for 7 days on things they were grateful for or keeping a food diary. And they found patients who wrote gratitude improved the mental health and a variety of standards over those who just kept a gratitude, or over those who just kept a food journal. Again, this was used actually for suicidal patients. A variety of studies using gratitude have shown the benefit of it as a mental health adjunct, and there is also a recent study with tinnitus and gratitude. An article called Dispositional Mindfulness, Gratitude, and Self-Compassionate Factors Affecting Tinnitus Distress. Try saying that 3 times fast. The conclusions of this article were more dispositional mindfulness, gratitude, and self-compassion were associated with lower tinnitus distress and psychological distress. More negative cognition and fewer positive cognitions about tinnitus were associated with tinnitus and psychological distress. So, not surprisingly, gratitude is not only good for our mental health in general, but for our tinnitus. So, that's the wrap. We've gone through 5 mental health interventions for tinnitus: cognitive behavior therapy, mindfulness, acceptance and commitment therapy, positive psychology, dialectical behavior therapy, and polyvagal theory. Well, 6 if you're counting. So let me leave you with some resources. As I said, my My main work is the mindfulness, and I really believe everyone with tinnitus should take a mindfulness course. Don't have to take my mindfulness class because I cannot teach everyone with mindfulness, but it is the best stress reduction strategy. We know you should have it under your belt. I teach an 8-week class that meets for 2.5 hours, classic MBSR class, 2.5 hours a week. Once you're expected to practice. On the off days, that another class starting October 24th. You could take classes in your community. If you're in a big city, probably have a MBSR teacher there. They are online. The University of California at San Diego for mindfulness, where I was trained, have courses starting monthly. You could hop on one of those. Jennifer Gans has a wonderful mindfulness-based tinnitus class. She was actually the author of one of the studies demonstrating the effectiveness of mindfulness training that you can download yourself and do it at your own pace. Mine is live online. You're working with other tinnitus folks. There's also a free version of this that is, as I say, it's the real deal. It's an 8-week class. You can just go to the website, palousmindfulness.com, for free to try it out for yourself. I do think it's difficult to teach yourself meditation and mindfulness, but give it a try. This can introduce it to you, and maybe you can figure this out all on your own. If not, go to a professional course for professional training. It's the best money you will ever spend. So those are courses or resources for mindfulness. For some of the therapies we looked at, acceptance and commitment therapy, again, ton of resources. Stephen Hayes' book, Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life, is a good starting place. Deb Dana has a number of books. This one is actually not her most recent one. Her most recent one is called Anchored, How to Befriend Your Nervous System Using Polyvagal Theory or something like that. And it's written for the general audience. Her 2 previous books are really directed at therapists. So Deb Dana is a good person to pick up. Positive psychology, there's a lot of stuff. But I think the best resource is a website called Greater Good, and there's a podcast called Science of Happiness that goes along with this that I look at every week. It's a source of ongoing positive psychology, which is a good thing to, I think, have in our tinnitus toolkit. And finally, if you're interested in dialectical behavior therapy, a lot of books. The Harbinger self-help workbooks are the most accessible. Some more complicated books for therapists, but there's a whole series of these that I think you could get a lot out of. And finally, if you have any questions for me, you can write me at peter@therapistwithtinnitus.com. You can get some information on my mindfulness class at www.onlinetinnitusclass.com. You can look at my blog and my website, therapistwithtinnitus.com. I have a free newsletter put out every month called Beyond CBT, oddly enough. And again, you can sign up for that at my website, therapistwithtinnitus.com. And finally, I have a YouTube channel. And there is the link to that, and maybe you found this there. So that's all for now. Please contact me if I can be of help, and take care.